Mình đang ở trong cái nhà thờ này, nó rất là đẹp. Cách trang trí nó rất là đẹp. Like this. Trang trí cái này rất là đẹp. Coi cái này phía trong rất là đẹp. Very good. Nó làm đẹp quá. Cái này đẹp quá. Cảnh đẹp thiệt đấy chứ. Cái nhà thờ này cảnh đẹp á. Wow.
Làm giống như cái cô ấy đó kìa.
Cái thiên đàng giờ đây.
Giống cái phòng nó xem đẹp ra.
Thấy không? Mình chỉ cần ví bằng nhỏ này uống cà phê là ok rồi ha.
Dạ.
Cái này nó thích
Đã thiệt cái chứ. Trang trí xa xa giống như quán cà phê đẹp không?
Cái gì vậy?
Đơn sơ mà đẹp thiệt á.
I have a dream phải không?
Quá đẹp.
Cái cây này giống như là cái cây ở chỗ đi bộ phía từ bến Chích này.
Chairs, but we've taken some out. So
Okay.
we're slowly putting them back in.
Okay. You have 1 or 2 service in the morning?
We've got one on Thursday nights and then 2 on Sundays. What church are you from?
Ở chỗ văn phòng của công ty họ cũng có một cái giống nhỏ hơn, tương tự giống vậy.
Yeah, very nice. How long have you been here? This building?
This building has been here, I think, 10 years.
For the building.
Đẹp quá ha. Trang trí cái lộng lẫy quá ha. Ở cái
Sao? Lên trước ngồi cho nó thấy rõ phải không?
đâu cũng
Không
vậy
muốn ngồi ở
thôi.
đây. Không muốn mai con muốn ngồi đâu.
Ngồi sau đi.
Có video đâu được hả?
Ngay dưới đây là tốt nhất này. Cái này là best này. Cái này là tốt nhất.
Được quá.
Cái này đẹp thiệt á.
Cho nên nó là no. kids they love it.
Món này là cái món gì ta?
Món này món của người Trung Đông.
Ồ. Chứ không phải là của người Mỹ. Cái này Mỹ quá vậy.
Không phải.
Hả?
Không phải của người Việt, người Hy Lạp.
Ok, cảm ơn Chúa cho thức ăn.
Chút xíu nữa anh ăn mới dừng lại cùng.
This is by Shireen. Shireen has been doling out food, and she's an amazing person who she has a catering company in Winston-Salem, and it is also a women's empowerment program. So a lot of immigrant women that come in actually work with her, especially those of Middle Eastern descent. And so I want to give a shout out to Shireen. So if you enjoy this food, she caters, it's amazing. And so thank you so much. Just a few logistics before we jump into the bulk of our program. If you do need to use the restroom, they are out these back doors and just to the left. Both the men's and women's are right there. And so feel free at any time to head out that way. And I know you already started eating, but I was hoping that we can just pause and pray and thank God for this food and for those that provided it as well. So if you would join me in prayer. God, we want to thank you for everyone that's in this room. For their hearts for you, their hearts for everyone within our community. Just for the amazing truth that everyone here in the Triad, everyone here in the state and in this country and around this world was made in your image, deserving of love and safety and a home. So God, I pray that you move us to listen well, to hear their stories, to speak well, to raise their stories so that others may hear them as well. God, we want to thank you for those that provided space for us today. We want to thank you for the food and those that prepared it, those that grew it, those that got it to our table. We thank you for the love that you give us, and may we always be an outpouring of that love for others. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Well, it's my absolute privilege to introduce one of my favorite people. She is someone who speaks so well, just with intelligence and compassion and faith about immigration issues. I've learned so much from her throughout my time with World Relief. She's one of the people I knew before I joined World Relief, and I had a little bit of fanboy times when I got to work with her, which is great. But Jenny Yang, she is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, and she provides oversight for all of our advocacy initiatives and policy positions. And she leads the organization's public relations strategy. And so she, in her position, she's the chief liaison between World Relief and the U.S. government. She provides policy analysis and she builds public support for the organization's advocacy priorities. She started working at World Relief, managing the entire refugee caseload for the organization in its partnership with the United States State Department and has worked for over a decade in refugee protection, immigration, and human rights. She's on an active deployment roster for the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees as a resettlement specialist. And before she was with World Relief, she worked at one of the largest political consulting companies in Maryland, fundraising and running campaigns for local elected officials. She's the current co-chair of the Advocacy Committee for RCUSA, which is the Refugee Council of the United States, where she leads a coalition of 28 organizations in advocacy and communication strategies in support of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. Jenny, she is the co-author of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate, and that book is actually available in the back. It's an amazing insight into our immigration policies, especially from a faith-based perspective. And she's also a contributing author to 5 other books. She was named one of the 50 women to watch by Christianity Today. So Jenny, thank you for being with us. Let's all give her a great welcome so she can share with us today.
Well, it is such a joy for me to be here amongst friends and amongst all of you. So my name is Jenny Yang, as Rob mentioned, and I have the privilege of working for World Relief with my amazing team, Rob and Abby, and so many others in this community. And so I really want this to be a presentation, but also an open dialogue at the end, answering any questions you may have, and just trying to really facilitate a Christian response to what can be a very tough issue. But before I start talking about what is this very tough issue, I want to get personal, because immigration, we know, is not just a political issue or a policy issue, it's a people issue. We're talking about individuals who are made in the image of God, who for one reason or another are moving from one place to another. And that is a story that is personal to me. I say that because you'll see this photo of my father. He is the boy in the white hat. This is the only picture that my father has of himself as a little boy. That's a stark comparison to the over 10,000 pictures I have on my iPhone of my two sons. And so comparing the fact that I have thousands of photos on my one single device, whereas this is the sole picture that my father has, speaks to the challenges he had growing up in war-torn Korea. Now, my father was just a young boy at the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, and his father, my grandfather, was a newspaper journalist. And during the beginning of the war, the communist forces were targeting media personnel. And so my dad remembers hearing a knock at the door, and the communist soldiers literally grabbed my grandfather out of the house, pulled him out, and my dad never saw him again. He was about 3 years old at that time. Several years later, as he was living with his mother, his mom became extremely sick, and so she passed away. And so at the young age of only 8, my father was orphaned in war-torn Korea. Now, at that time, my father ended up living with his uncle, who provided for him, but because he didn't have any siblings and any parents, he felt a constant sense of loss and of longing and of heartache. In fact, he says he would cry all the time because he was so sad for living in desperate poverty and not having any family to really take care of him. And so one of the things he became really good at, even as he was biking and delivering newspapers to get money for school and for food and tutoring kids after class to just afford school food at the school, was fixing cars. And he became so good at fixing cars that eventually he entered a national car repair competition and won first place. And one of the judges asked my father if he would like to immigrate with him to the United States of America. Now, during that time, many American missionaries were setting up schools in Korea. And so my father had heard about the United States from these American missionaries. And in fact, he had a good working knowledge of English because he actually learned English at some of these American missionary schools that were set up in Korea at that time. So eventually my father was sponsored by Ford Motor Company to come to the United States. And he worked so hard, he was promoted to be a manager, but then he eventually had this dream of opening up his own business. And so he opened up his own business in downtown Philadelphia into a car mechanic shop. He converted a Popeyes restaurant into a car mechanic shop, and imagine the challenges of doing that. And so he did that. And for over 30 years, he served the Philadelphia community, not just fixing cars, but actually serving in our local church that I grew up in and doing media writing. And he was always writing and doing media for our local church. Really, I think because that was in his genes from his own father. And so when I was growing up, I was born in Philadelphia, me and my brother. I would always hear these stories from my father of what it was like for him growing up as an orphan in Korea. And what it was like for him to really achieve this dream of eventually immigrating to the United States of America. And so this dual identity that I've had both as a Korean and as an American was something that I navigated pretty well, I think, growing up in Philadelphia. Not only did I speak 2 languages, but I got to eat all delicious Korean food, while also trying to understand what it really feels like to fit into this country. So the story of my dad is pretty unique, but the story of migration, the story of people who are oftentimes living in war-torn countries or fleeing immense poverty is a story that is similar to millions of people around the world. When we think about migration today, this is not just an issue that's impacting the United States of America, but in countries around the world, they're being impacted by migrants who are crossing borders to seek opportunities and looking for safety if their homes have been torn apart by war. Now, I want to show you this map of what diversity looks like in the United States of America. You see on the very left, there's this image of the United States back in 1960. And the dark states represent states in which there is increasing diversity in the US. And so you'll see in 1960, the likelihood that the one other person you know is of a different race was very minimal. So in the 1960s, you'll see that there wasn't much diversity in the United States of America. But fast forward 50 years later to 2010, you'll see there's increasing diversity. And by 2060, you'll see that almost every state in this country, almost half of the individuals in that community will be people who are of a different race than you. And my question to you is, as you see this map and as you see this transgression of increasing diversity, does it strike fear in your heart or does it strike excitement in your heart? And a question for you all is, if you have excitement, why are you excited about these changes? And if you have fear, what causes that fear in your heart? And I say these questions because when we talk about migration and changing cultures around us, it's not just about changing, racially, but it's about changing culturally and about changing the things that are around us that maybe make us feel comfortable. But I ask that question because I think it's a question we have to grapple with as not just Americans, but as followers of Jesus. And in a little bit, I'll go into the theology of migration and how we can root a response and really what the scriptures have to teach us. And so a few years ago, there was an exercise that was done that looked at where are the nations where people are coming from. And what we found is that other than Mexico, there was a diversity of nations that were represented in this country. In fact, in Idaho, you'll see that the second largest nationality other than Mexicans were Iraqis. And you'll see in New York, the second greatest nationality outside of Mexicans is the Chinese. And in North Carolina, you'll see that after Mexicans, Indians are actually the nationality that is highest represented in the state. And so over the years, there's been a lot of controversial questions, which I really want to address and talk about today, which is, why are there so many immigrants coming here to this country? Why can't they wait their turn in line if they're here illegally? Why can't they immigrate the legal way, just like my ancestors did? And what will happen to our community and our culture when we see so much change? But I think these questions that many of us maybe have grappled with in our minds and that is talked about amongst our elected officials is not a new question. In fact, since the founding of our country, our founding fathers had these very same questions. What does it mean to be an American? How many people should we let in? Should we welcome these people that are very different than us? What's going to happen to our communities and our cultures and our values and our ideals if we see so many people who are trying to enter into this country? Now, Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s said this, and he was referring to a group of German immigrants that were immigrating into Pennsylvania at that time. He said, "Why should the German immigrants establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to change us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" Now, when you read this, you probably think, I didn't know that the English and the Germans had different complexions, but back in the 1750s, this was a huge concern. The English, who had founded the United States in large numbers, were afraid that the Germans, who had a different complexion than the English, who didn't speak English, they spoke German, couldn't assimilate. And so there's a sense from Benjamin Franklin, even back then, that German immigrants were not welcome to this country. Now, fast forward about 30 years later, when George Washington was actually addressing a group of Irish immigrants. And he said that the bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to participate to all of our rights and privileges if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the employment. And so you see from these two historical figures, these looming father figures of our country, who had divergent positions and views on immigration. And if you read any of these quotes, you could probably apply that to the current immigration conversation. But this was also something that our founding fathers grappled with, even our first president, as he figured out what we are to do and respond to the waves of immigrants that were coming at that time. Now, how many of you have roots or immigration stories in your own family from England or Germany? Yeah, so several of you. And were you aware that there was discrimination against Germans when they were first immigrating here? A little bit, right? And I think some of us, as we learned about U.S. history, were well aware that many Irish immigrants, when they immigrated here, were discriminated against because they were Catholic and because they were coming from desperately poor Ireland. And so there was these continuing waves of immigrants that were coming into Korea at that time. And so this backlash against new groups of immigrants is something that is not new to the United States. It's a part of our common history. And it wasn't until the late 1800s or so that we really saw kind of significant backlashes against particular groups of people. In the early 1800s, we saw this backlash against Irish immigrants and even German immigrants. But in the late 1800s, as Chinese immigrants came to the United States, the Congress actually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the reasoning they passed this act was because they felt like the Chinese were intellectually inferior to Americans. This is actually language in US law. And for over 60 years, they didn't allow new Chinese laborers to come into the United States of America, and even prevented marriage amongst Chinese immigrants so that they could not expand their families once they got here. And it wasn't until the 1940s that the Chinese Exclusion Act was actually repealed. And so it wasn't until the 1920s or so, when the United States was really closed off to immigration from many parts of the world, that the US Congress said, well, what is it that we can do, not to just exclude the Chinese, but to really have a system in place that will allow immigrants to be able to immigrate to the United States of America. And so when the National Origins Act passed in the 1920s, it actually was the first instance of a visa where someone had to have a legal permission from our government to be able to enter to the United States of America. And I think this is an important fact, because in many situations, I've been asked the question, well, the immigrants of today should immigrate just like my ancestors did. The people of today should be coming just like my grandparents came or my great-grandparents came, either through Ellis Island or, even before them. But that's really like comparing apples and oranges, because before 1924, there was no illegal way for someone to come. If you're fleeing poverty, or you're fleeing persecution, or a myriad of reasons that were forcing you to leave your home, if you were to come into the United States of America, you could basically legally come. And in fact, over 90% of immigrants that were processed through Ellis Island, unless it was for a significant health reason, were able to legally enter into the United States of America. And it wasn't until the 1960s, when our country was grappling with racial divisions, and when we were talking about civil rights and what that would mean for Black people in this country, that we looked at our laws and said, if we're gonna have laws on the books excluding certain nationalities from coming in, we should have our immigration laws instead based on our values. And what are our values as a country? And that is when Congress decided that our immigration laws shouldn't be based on where you're coming from, but it should be based on whether or not you can find a job here and whether you have family here. And that is the basis of our formal immigration system today. Is if you have close family members in the United States of America, they can apply for you to come to the United States, regardless of where you're from. And secondly, if you can find a job, that's another opportunity for an individual to be able to come and work in the United States of America. So for example, when you look at my own personal family, the fact that my father was able to be sponsored by Ford Motor Company meant that he was able to get an employment-based visa to be able to come into this country and work. But my cousins and my mom's sisters, she actually applied for them to come into the US, and they weren't sponsored by a company, but because my aunt was related to my mother, my mom could apply for her sister, and it took over 15 years for them to process that application. And today, my aunt lives in Philadelphia with my family, and they are raising their family there right now. And so when we think about this total immigrant population, we think about the various pathways that people can come into this country. It's through a family-based system, it's through an employment-based system, but it's also for humanitarian reasons. And in fact, that is one small avenue through which immigrants can come into this country. Now, it's important to remember that for anyone who's trying to enter the United States, that you have to fit into one of these categories. And 70% of those who are immigrating to this country are actually immigrating here because they have family already here. And so it's your sister or your brother or your parent or your child, and it's that person applying for you to come that allows you to come. But we also have very narrow opportunities for people who have work here or are seeking protection here because of persecution for these individuals to come. Now, the president himself signs the refugee ceiling every year, and for this fiscal year, which started on October 1st, the number of refugees that can be allowed into the United States is 125,000 refugees a year. Now, we're not nowhere near close to resettling that number into the United States, but that's a goal that we want to reach. And when you look historically at the numbers of refugees who have come in over the many years, in 1980, at the height of the Vietnam War, the end of the Vietnam War, the US resettled over 200,000 Vietnamese refugees in 1980. And so, in fact, when you meet a lot of Vietnamese people today, they can tell you about their family story of what it was like to flee across in a boat and what it was like for them to arrive here in large numbers. And that is a root of many of the Vietnamese individuals in our communities today. And so I talk about the legal way through which many individuals can come, but I think it's also important to talk not just about people like my family that came and were sponsored by a company, but about the millions of those in our country who perhaps came across the border in an unauthorized fashion and are living in our communities today. There are an estimated 11 million people in our country who are undocumented, and many of these come from Mexico and from Central America, but there's also a large number of people who are coming from Asia who are here undocumented as well. And this became crystallized to me when I was writing the book, Welcoming the Stranger, and I went to my parents' home in Philadelphia on a writing break. And I remember it was over Christmas and I was writing this book, and every morning I was so stressed out because I felt like I couldn't get the writing done. So my mom's like, you need to be prayed over by your pastor. And so she pulls me out of bed, and then we go to my Korean Presbyterian church, and my youth pastor is there, and so he puts his hands on me and he's praying for me. And after he prays for me, he says, you know, Jenny, I'm so glad you're writing this book, because I don't know if you know this, but right here in the Korean church that you grew up in, there's 3 Korean undocumented kids that we found out were here without authorization. And he said, do you remember, Jenny, when you went to Mexico on missions trips and you visited these Mexican communities, and that was your missions trip when you were in high school? Well, these kids, if they were to go to Mexico on a missions trip, they can't come back into the US because they're here without authorization. And so my Korean church that I grew up in, instead of now sending missions teams to Mexico, they're not going overseas anymore, but they're actually doing missions in their local community, in their local city, because there's a fear that for these specific students who are undocumented, if they leave the United States, they actually cannot come in. And so it was startling to me because, first of all, I thought, well, Koreans never break the law. So the fact that Koreans were breaking immigration law was like complete news to me. I grew up not knowing a single undocumented immigrant. So I just could not believe that there were Korean undocumented immigrants. But it really honed in for me the reality that for a lot of communities across the United States, not just the Mexican community or the Latino community, that even amongst the Asian community, that there continues to be challenges with immigration. And so I talked to you about the realities of our history, the realities of our current immigration laws, and even those who are here undocumented today. And so at World Belief and across many communities across the United States, we formed a coalition called the Evangelical Immigration Table with the Southern Baptist Convention and with the Consortium of Christian Colleges and Universities and others, to all advocate for a humane approach to immigration reform. And it's really based on 4 principles. The first is, we believe that we need strong border security. We think, and we support our Border Patrol agents and others who are doing really incredible efforts to secure the border. It is a very tough job, but I believe they need the right resources and the right technology to be able to manage the border well. The second is, I talked about how long it took for my own family, extended family, to immigrate here, and there continues to be 15 to 20 year long waits for many families to be able to immigrate to the United States of America. We've been advocating for a reduction in the waiting times for many of these family-based petitions to be processed as quickly as possible. The third is, there has to be more flexible ways for immigrants to be able to enter legally with work authorization. There are right now, in our current immigration system, only 1,400 visas available for someone to come in and work in a low-skilled job on a permanent basis. A year, 1,400 a year. Now that is a current number of people who entered Ellis Island in a single day in the 1920s, and that is the number of visas we have available for a low-skilled worker to come into the United States to work a year. And so if we're gonna close the door for unauthorized immigrants, we need to open the door for authorized immigrants to come in. But the reality is we also have this population of undocumented immigrants in this country. The question has been, what should we do with those who are here without documentation? And the position that we've taken with a lot of other organizations, including businesses and faith communities and others, is that there has to be an opportunity for restitution. There has to be an opportunity for individuals who have broken immigration laws to come forward and say that immigration laws were broken, but then to earn a pathway towards some kind of legalization, especially when you consider that more than half of these families, these individuals, have been in the United States for over 10 years. And so these are people who have built homes, who have US citizen children, and are waiting to do what's right in this country today. When you zoom in on North Carolina specifically, there continues to be a lot of challenges with this right here in your own state. North Carolina is home to about 100,000 farm workers who have worked in picking sweet potatoes and tomatoes and cucumbers. And nationally, on average, a farm worker makes about $11,000 a year. And for a family, that's around $16,000 a year. Most farm workers are actually exempt from minimum wage laws and even exempt from overtime provisions, which really result in many of these farm workers working many, many hours a day in really, really tough conditions. And when you look at the most dangerous occupations in the world, farm labor ranks as one of the top 3 most dangerous occupations in the United States. And a significant percentage of these individuals are made up of immigrants who are coming from nations around the world. And I just want to mention that as we think about what are ways to, for us as a community to respond, but also elected officials, that there was a bill introduced earlier this year that actually passed with bipartisan support called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act that would actually provide restitution for many of these individuals and actually provide a future way for immigrants to be able to come in legally with protections to work as farm workers in this country today. And this bill called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act actually passed the House in March of this year, but it's still waiting to be passed by the Senate. Another community that I just want to highlight for you as well is the Dreamer community. Now, these are individuals that came into the United States at a very young age, and many of these people had no idea that they were here without authorization when their parents brought them into this country. And it wasn't until they applied for colleges and they were trying to apply for federal benefits that they realized they didn't have a social security number and thus couldn't actually apply for federal benefits because they weren't eligible. And many of their hopes for going to college were really crushed when they found out this information. There's a group called Voices of Christian Dreamers that we've been working with who are young Christians who are dreamers, people who came to this country without authorization as children, and are really working with Congress to pass laws that would actually allow them to earn some kind of legalization in this country. And so the bill related to that is the American Dream and Promise Act, which actually also passed with the Farm Workers Modernization Act back in March. And so these were 2 bills that were passed in the House that are ripe for the Senate to pass as well. And so this just speaks to the bipartisan support that we've seen across both Democratic and Republican parties to address what have been long-standing issues in our country around farm workers who really continue to toil and are the engines of our economy, for them to have proper protections, and even for young immigrants who came to this country to have proper protections as well. But even as I talk about these specific populations and what we can do to respond, I also think it's important for us to zoom out and actually look at what's happening around the world regarding refugees. Right now, we are facing the world's worst refugee crisis, where an estimated 80 million people have been forced to flee from their homes. And many of these individuals are going to neighboring countries, but there's a small number that are actually arriving to the United States of America as well. And so I want to share this photo with you of Mustafa. He's the individual holding this green folder. And he was a Syrian refugee that was resettled to Baltimore, where I live. And he remembers telling me, or he was recounting to me, how in his high school, he was actually at a doctor's appointment when a bomb fell on his school and 3 of his closest friends passed away. He fled into Turkey to find safety, And it was in Turkey that he was actually referred to the U.S. Refugee Settlement Program. And he actually came in as a refugee to the United States, and that is where I met him. But I share the story of Mustafa because we can talk about the millions, but it's actually about the one individual and their story and their experiences and their hopes for a better future for themselves and their families. And perhaps for many of us, this moment crystallized for us just 2 months ago when we saw the images of the desperate Afghans that were fleeing to U.S. military aircrafts as they were leaving that community. Just last night, I actually saw an Afghan family that was arriving to Greensboro Airport. And it was parents and 2 young boys, and they didn't know how to get on the plane, and they had their IOM, their travel bags with them. And so I facilitated them getting on the plane, and you can see right here that there were a couple of volunteers that were welcoming them into the local community. And you could tell on the plane that they were very nervous, and they had had a very long travel day. But when they met this American family and their caseworkers, there was a sense of relief. You could tell visibly on their faces, and smiles that emerged from them, from the kids, as they really felt a strong sense of welcome from the local community here, as they were welcoming these individuals to this area. And so I talked a bit about the history and the current realities of our law, and even the number of Afghans that are coming here. But I think for many of us who follow Jesus, there is a biblical perspective to this issue, and a scriptural and a theological perspective that is fundamentally important. And so I want to challenge us today, as we learn about the history and the laws of our country, to really root our response as a church in scripture and in theology. And first, I'm going to talk about why immigration is a biblical issue. You know, I grew up in this Korean Presbyterian church in Northwest Philadelphia, where I read my Bible through and through. I knew my Bible songs, I knew scripture very, very well, and memorized my Bible verses. But I did not know that if you actually read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, the whole story of scripture is a narrative about people who are constantly on the move. In fact, the whole story of scripture is actually a story about migration. It's about God accomplishing his missional purposes through the movement of people. And in fact, almost every single major biblical character was an immigrant at one point or another in his or her life. The first instance and example of an immigrant I can find in scripture is Abraham. God literally commanded him to leave his homeland and to go to another land that God would show him. Now, Abraham didn't know where he was going or how he was going to get there, but he knew that God would provide for him when he moved. And in fact, it was a testament of God's faithfulness to his life when he moved, and God actually provided him for him and his family in his new home. Another person that we can think who is an immigrant is Joseph. He was actually sold into slavery by his brothers. He was a biblical victim of human trafficking. And it was in that form as a slave that he actually crossed borders into many countries as a slave. And he experienced God's faithfulness, and he was questioning his status in life, even as a slave during that time. Another person I can think of who was an immigrant was Ruth. She actually followed her mother-in-law, Naomi, and became a migrant worker. And it was when she was gleaning the fields as a migrant worker that Boaz noticed her character and fell in love with her as a migrant worker. But perhaps the greatest immigrant of all in scripture is Jesus himself. When he was a little baby boy, there was an edict out that was supposed to kill all the Jewish babies under the age of 2. And Mary and Joseph had to flee into Egypt in order to save his life. Now, many of us are going to be celebrating Christmas in just a few months, and we have a nativity scene of baby Jesus and the Magi, and maybe a sheep and a donkey in that nativity scene. But many of us don't have the figure of King Herod, even though he was such a central figure to the early Christmas story, and to the experiences and the vulnerability and the sense of loss and insecurity that Jesus' own family felt when he was just a little baby. And in fact, when you read throughout the New Testament, what you'll see is it was through migration that the gospel spread, wasn't it? It was when Paul was going from one place to another, when he was shipwrecked, when he went into these communities and countries, that he was able to share about the good news of the gospel. And it was really through migration that the gospel spread. What you see throughout the Old Testament is that the word for ger or immigrant is G-E-R, and it's actually mentioned 92 times in the Old Testament alone. In fact, what you'll see is that immigrants are oftentimes grouped with orphans and widows as people who are particularly vulnerable, because these were individuals who didn't have family support structures or even resources to really help them in their as they lived their lives. And so God repeatedly commanded the Israelites to take special concern for these individuals, because that was a reflection of God's love for them. So in Leviticus 19, for example, it says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat him. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you are foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And in fact, he says in Deuteronomy 10:18, for example, that he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the alien. In Psalm 146, it says, the Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow. It says in Zechariah 7:10 to not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the alien, poor. And in Malachi 3:5, it says, I will be quick to testify against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive aliens of justice. If the Lord defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, if the Lord watches over the alien, sustains the fatherless, if he does not oppress these vulnerable groups, if he testifies against those who defraud laborers of their wages, aren't these the specific actions that we as his image bearers should carry out to those who are vulnerable in our midst? Shouldn't we, as people who are followers of Jesus, also defend the cause of these vulnerable people? Aren't we responsible also for watching over these individuals, for testifying against those who do injustice and not oppress the widow, the fatherless, and the widow? In fact, when you see throughout scriptures God executing his justice, he actually used ordinary people like Esther and Moses and even Nehemiah to really bring about systemic change for a people group who are particularly vulnerable. You know, we see an example of Moses, that he was someone who went before Pharaoh and actually pleaded for the case of his people to be freed from slavery. Even in the story of Esther, we see an ordinary individual who used her privilege and her resources and her voice to advocate before the king to save the Jewish people from genocide. And even Nehemiah, he used his resources and his abilities to plead with the king for resources to build a wall around Jerusalem. And it's an extraordinary example, the whole book of Nehemiah, about an individual being used by God to protect a vulnerable people group. This idea of loving and caring for the stranger is not just executed through us as his vessels and as ambassadors, but what you see throughout the New Testament is the teachings of Jesus that we will be blessed in relationship with the other. In fact, in Matthew 25, it says, in Jesus' own words, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was a stranger, you invited me in. Jesus says these words because he intimately knows what it feels like to be a refugee. It intimately knows what it feels like to be hungry, to be thirsty, and what it means for us as a community to reflect his justice and his compassion to a world of people who are broken and hurting. And in fact, in Hebrews 13:2, it says to not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. The word for entertaining strangers is philoxenia. Philos is love, and xenia is the stranger in Greek. The opposite of this idea of biblical hospitality or philoxenia is xenophobia, which is a fear of the stranger. Scripture teaches us to love the stranger, philoxenia, and to not fear the stranger. You know, we think about hospitality as something that we should all carry out as we go about our day. Dr. Soong-Chan Ra is a missiologist, and he said that we should go from hostility to hospitality, but from hospitality to household. Because from hostility, which is a sense of fear or antagonism against the other, we need to create a sense of welcome for these individuals. But if we only create a sense of welcome but don't receive from these individuals, then there is no sense of mutuality in that relationship. And so creating a household actually means treating the other like they were part of our family, as if we are all equal members of the same society, afforded the same rights and responsibilities for these individuals as well. And it is the sense of mutuality that I think is so important as we think about serving and loving our immigrant neighbors well. You know, when I've gotten to know my refugee and immigrant neighbors in Baltimore where I live, I remember volunteering with this one Iranian family, and I would pick them up at the airport, and every week I would go to their house and teach them English. But after a while, the family started cooking for me, and so every week I would have this amazing dinner at their house, and they would talk to me about what it was like living in Iran and the experiences that they had as a Baha'i believer living in Iran that was persecuting the Baha'i believers at that time. And it was really through that experience that I feel like I actually received more from these individuals than I was able to give. You know, initially I had volunteered thinking that I had so much to give, and to a certain degree I did. But in the end, I think I received so much more from the relationships than I was able to give. But I also think this is an incredible missional opportunity for the church. In fact, in Matthew 28:19, Jesus, for many years, our churches have been sending missionaries abroad to communities that have never heard the gospel before. But what if instead of sending missionaries, we have an opportunity to participate in missions by never even having to leave our own communities and our own neighborhoods? What if instead of us going to the world is actually coming to us? We have an incredible opportunity through the arrival of refugees from many communities and nations across the world, and through immigrants themselves, to share the good news with people who may never have heard the gospel before, but also to receive the good news from these individuals, many of whom are actually believers themselves. The Great Commission tells us that we are to make disciples of all nations, and the Great Commandment tells us that we can love our neighbors as ourselves. I believe by loving our immigrant neighbors, we're able to fulfill the Great Commission and carry out the Great Commandment at the same exact time. Missiologist J.D. Payne said this. He said, something is missionally malignant whenever we're willing to make great sacrifices to travel the world to reach a people group, but are not willing to walk across the street. A few years ago, we did an exercise where we mapped out all the nations that our refugee friends were coming from. And what we found is that the largest nationalities that were coming in from areas in which they had the greatest number of unreached people groups. So places like Iraq and Burma and Somalia and Syria were all places where there are the most unreached people groups. But these are the individuals that were coming in largest numbers into the United States of America. If this is not a missional opportunity for us as a church, I don't know what is. I think we have an opportunity to step into this crisis, not just to serve Afghans that are coming into our communities, but other nationalities and refugees and immigrants. And it's really through this beautiful, diverse tapestry of all nations that I believe we will be able to live out the essence of the gospel. Dr. Timothy Tennant is a president of Asbury Theological Seminary, and he said this. He said 86% of the immigrant population in North America are likely to either be Christians or become Christians. That's far above the national average. The immigrant population actually presents the greatest hope for Christian renewal in North America. This group that we want to keep out is actually the group that we most need for spiritual transformation. We shouldn't see this as something that threatens us. We should see this as a wonderful opportunity. I say oftentimes that migration is not just changing the face of our country. Migration is literally changing the face of Christianity. This is beyond a political issue. This is beyond a policy issue. I believe this is fundamentally a theological issue and a spiritual issue. The way that we respond to those who are amongst us, who are different than us, who are vulnerable and coming from many nations, I think is a direct test of what we believe in the gospel itself. I believe we have an incredible opportunity to show the love of Christ to our neighbors, and by doing so, we have an incredible opportunity to demonstrate to them what the love of Christ was all about. And so I just want to conclude by encouraging you to do 6 things, summed up in the acronym PLEASE, P-L-E-A-S-E. And the first is prayer. God commands us to pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians. I believe we have a responsibility to pray for our country, to pray for our elected officials, to pray for our immigrant brothers and sisters, to pray for the church, that we will respond in a way that really reflects God's heart and his mind on a really tough issue like immigration. The second thing that I would encourage us to do is to listen. Many of us may not have an immigrant stories ourselves, but I believe we have a responsibility to listen to the stories of our immigrant neighbors, some of whom have gone through significant challenges and difficulties, to understand what they're going through, and also to listen to scripture itself. We at World Belief have a resource called Welcoming the Stranger, which is a learning guide, and many churches across the country have downloaded this guide for small groups to study together, and it's an incredible resource that you all can use in your church communities as well. There's also just 2 books that I want to know, No Longer Strangers and Welcoming the Stranger. These are 2 books that we've used as a resource to really help guide churches in their response to immigration as well. The A is for advocacy and plea, so prayer, listening, education, and advocacy. And advocacy is so important because God calls us not just to be stewards of our resources and our finances, but to be stewards of our voice and to use our voice to speak up on behalf of those who do not have a voice. And Martin Luther King Jr., he said this once. He said, on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that should only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Our office here in the Tri area is eager and willing to work with you all, not just to raise your voices, to contact your elected officials, to have ongoing policy and structural support for those who are coming in here, but also to have many of you volunteer and to come alongside you in your journey as you learn more about how you can respond spiritually and theologically to this issue of immigration as well. And so as we partner together, we hope that you will serve these communities, that you will also live out evangelism to these communities, the S and the E, and really journey with us as we welcome our newest neighbors. You know, in the end, at World Relief, we're not just about creating a place to live, we're ultimately about creating a place to belong. It's creating the sense of belonging amongst our newest immigrant neighbors that I believe will allow many of them to experience the love of Christ. And I believe at this moment in history, we as a church community are able to step up into the collective responsibility I believe we have to show our newest neighbors the love of Christ. I believe we will make huge impacts for the kingdom of Christ. And with that, I look forward to your questions and thank you for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was awesome. Every time I think I have learned so much about this topic, there's something else that I learned, so that was awesome. So I'm gonna pull up a stool here. We'll go ahead and get into these questions. We should have, oh yeah, there it is, a QR code on the screen. If you are technologically knowledgeable in that, you can use your phone to take a picture of that and start submitting your questions. But I do have some questions that we had submitted during RSVP, and so I'm going to go ahead and ask a few of those. So the first one we have is, what is the status of people coming from Haiti? And I actually had a question about this as well. Are they to be considered for TPS? Can they seek asylum? What's their status at the moment?
Yeah, so in Haiti right now, there continues to be significant humanitarian devastation. World Relief, we actually work in Haiti. We're one of the many humanitarian organizations that actually work through the local church in Port-au-Prince. And so we know intimately well what is happening in Haiti. They had a political coup in which their president was assassinated, and there continues to be earthquakes and hurricanes and just ongoing humanitarian consequences and extreme poverty in Haiti. So many of these individuals from Haiti have come into the United States of America, and many of these individuals are eligible for temporary protected status. But I think there's ongoing challenges because many of the individuals that are crossing the border, you probably saw the images of the Haitian asylum seekers in Texas. It continues to present a challenge for many of these individuals because we have a current policy right now called Title 42, in which if you cross the border, because of our public health laws, we're actually expelling most individuals to go back to their country of origin. And so this is a public health law that was instituted when the COVID pandemic began, and it continues to be a public health law in which we're expelling individuals from coming to the United States because of COVID-19. And so many of us in the advocacy community have said, well, if these individuals are coming in and have a valid claim to asylum or real protection concerns, you should not be expelling these individuals and providing them an opportunity to remain in this country. And so the Haitian community continues to have a lot of our support, and I think that, there continues to be challenges, not just with Title 42, but with the ongoing need for temporary protected status as well.
That's great. So the next question is, you kind of mentioned policies. Which ones are currently in place that might need to be changed, and how can we respond effectively? I know we'll talk about ones that haven't been put in place later, but if there are any in place that you think need to change, how can we respond to that?
Yeah, well, I just mentioned Title 42, and then the next thing that I would just ask for your support on is, so many of these Afghan community individuals are coming into North Carolina or coming right here into this community. And because they were evacuated by the US government, they actually are coming in on a temporary immigration status called parole. Now this status actually expires after 2 years, and we advocated for these individuals to get benefits because when they were coming in without any kind of access to any kind of benefits. And so because they're coming in on a temporary immigration status, it means that they have to apply for some kind of permanent immigration status. And many of these Afghan individuals are coming in, but for them to get permanent status, they're applying for asylum in the asylum system. Right now, there are 400,000 asylum cases that are backlogged in our asylum system. And so when you have thousands of Afghans that were evacuated by our own US government arriving in the US, we believe that they should have an opportunity to adjust their status to be able to get a green card after a year, versus having to apply to asylum, in which they would have to garner all their documents and basically make a claim, go before an immigration judge, and try to get a green card. And the reason why we think this is important is because many of these Afghans, I just showed you that picture of that Afghan family that arrived to Greensboro yesterday. They literally had one bag with them and as they were waiting for their luggage. And can you imagine literally leaving everything behind? They didn't speak very much English, and they're coming into a community in which their kids have to go to school, the parents have to find a job, and then on top of that, to go through the legal loopholes of trying to apply for asylum, which often takes many years, is not a process that we want them to go through. And so we've been actually advocating to Senator Tillis here and others to support the Afghan Adjustment Act, so that these individuals after a year can just apply to get a green card, which is somewhat of an automatic process, versus them applying for asylum, which would have them go to an immigration court. And I say this because if the United States historically has had opportunities for certain nationalities to adjust status when they're here. So the Cuban Adjustment Act, I don't know if you all know this, but if Cubans are able to enter into this country, if they arrive, they basically can automatically get a green card because they can adjust status once they're here. And so there have been over 1 million Cubans that have actually adjusted status and got a green card. And so if we're talking about an Afghan parolee population that's less than 100,000, and our own government evacuated them, I think our mission is not complete, that we have an ongoing responsibility to these individuals to give them the opportunity to adjust status while they're here as well, and give them a green card that they can apply for as well.
That's awesome. That kind of answers one of the questions, which is what we can do to help incoming Afghan families. I know in terms of advocacy, that's a huge thing that we're all pushing for right now, and at the end we'll have a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, and I would also say with the Afghan community and other refugees, I've been helping newly arriving refugees where I live in Baltimore, and just this one family yesterday, it was again a sea change for this one family to be welcomed by an American couple. And for many of you, if you want to volunteer with refugee families here, even help set up an apartment or get donations going from your church, these are all things that we need at our Triad office to continue to serve the refugees well. And our job really in this community is to help serve you, for you to volunteer and facilitate these interactions. Because if you all are activated and engaged, we feel like we're doing our job. And so we're really here to facilitate as much church engagement as possible. And so we'd love to partner with you in any way possible to really serve the communities here that are coming, that we know you can be blessed by in those relationships.
So this is kind of a longer question I'm going to combine with another question. So somebody asked, is there a way to make the legal immigration process simpler and faster? I'm sure there's a lot of ways that are discussed. And also, do you see the best answer as comprehensive reform or more piecemeal? So kind of combining those two, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the fact that earlier this year, the House passed on a bipartisan basis 2 bills, the Farm Worker Modernization Act and the DREAM Act, means that there is a lot of consensus around practical solutions for our immigration system. You know, this has been something actually that Senator Tillis has talked about for a while, and others, both Republicans and Democrats, the need to really just fix our broken immigration system. And so the principles that I laid out around, you know, providing our own pathway to legalization, reducing waiting times for immigrant families, really providing more avenues for people to be able to get a work visa to come in. These are all things that really have bipartisan support. And so I think what's really needed right now is the building of political will so that our elected officials feel like if they support these policies, that they can actually get support from local communities around the leadership on this issue. And I guess a question I had is, how many of you in this room have ever contacted your elected official or attended a town hall? So a lot of you have, okay. And so I would encourage you all to continue that engagement. You know, show up at the town halls, you know, make the calls into your members of Congress and connect with their office, because we'll continue to give you opportunities at really important times to connect with your member of Congress, to make those calls that we think are so important to really changing the political dial so that our elected officials will have the courage to support those that are in our communities.
I think that kind of answers the next question, which is what are the barriers for the Senate to take up the 2 bills that have been passed by the House regarding farm workers and dreamers? And to my understanding, it's finding that bipartisan solution, and that is what's kind of keeping the Senate from passing them right now.
Immigration continues to be a top agenda item, but obviously with COVID and other things, that was their priority, just passing bills to help address the pandemic. And so now we're in this position. You know, what's the next big issue? And so addressing immigration reform, we think is going to be critically important. And so having our elected officials, again, have political cover to really make these tough decisions is really what's going to be needed, I think, to get this across the finish line.
All right, we have time for about 1 or 2 more. So this is a great one that I know you'll be able to answer. What's the best guide or place for resources in terms of educating ourselves and our churches and communities about immigration?
Yeah, well, I pointed out just the 2 books, Welcoming Stranger, No Longer Stranger. I think maybe there's some copies back there. But there's a great resource. It's a social media campaign called Woman of Welcome. And they basically produce study guides, Bible studies, videos, just a ton of content for communities to create welcome in your local community. And so it's called Woman of Welcome. But I would also say the Evangelical Immigration Table is a coalition of World Relief, the Southern Baptist Convention, the National Association of Evangelicals, and others that are all working together to pass policy change. And if you actually look on the Evangelical Immigration Table website, you'll actually see videos of pastors preaching about immigration from the pulpit. Pastors of significant congregations, pastors who have written op-eds, church leaders that are doing a lot around engaging your church community. And so there's a lot you all can do, and examples on the Evangelical Immigration Table website as well.
Awesome. Well, with that actually segues perfectly into our ending. And I wanted to also mention thanks to our local pastors who are here today. It really is about mobilizing you guys to mobilize your church congregations and communities. That's going to lead to this faith-based change for immigration. And so with that, we'll go to the last slide. I want to invite you guys to use the sign up at your table, even if you've already been subscribed to our mailing list. We just want to take the time to follow up with you directly after this event and invite you to sign a letter that is through the Evangelical Immigration Table. Matt Sorens, who's our church mobilization director, and some others have put that together. It is going to petition for Farm Worker Modernization Act, Dreamers, DREAM Act, the Dream and Promise Act, and also the Cuban Adjustment Act. And so a lot of bills that we're trying to pass at the same time through that letter, which will then be presented to Capitol Hill. So it's an awesome opportunity for you guys to directly be able to show your support to your senators and representatives. With that, I wanted to thank you so much, Jenny. Let's give a big welcome round of applause. And thank you guys all so much for being here. I know that you had to take time out of your day, but it's been awesome just to see this turnout. I wanted to also end on the note of just recognizing that we all come from different political backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, even maybe faith backgrounds. And this topic, I believe, is something that transcends all of those barriers. And it is an individual, personal, human issue that I believe Jenny has communicated very effectively today. And also thank you so much to Shireen for the food. It was delicious. With that, if you have any other questions or if you have some time to look at some resources we have in the back, John Musser, our Mission Services Director, will be back there. Is welcome. Happy to answer any of your questions. We also have Welcoming the Stranger and some other books back there for your pleasure. Do you have anything else to share, Rob? All right, I think that's all. Thank you guys so much for being here today.
Second or third largest.
All right. Very good. Stay in touch. Let me know what Nancy says. Okay. And 3 of them are very short. The longest one is the training. It's 3 hours. Just sit through a training. For the form of group, we call it good neighbor team. And this group comes alongside an incoming refugee family. And so we would facilitate that connection. Usually we try not to have more than 8 or 10 adults.
Maybe we'll meet over lunch.
Yes, I would love to.
We'll turn out the steps. And then we'll come over to church and we'll put in the structure.
That sounds good.
Okay?
You let me know. Yeah. That should work. Yeah.
I say your name and phone number.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. And say your name again. H-U-N-G. Okay. Very good. Wonderful to meet you guys. So, yes. So very good.
Quay đó.
Do you have my card? Could you send me an email so I got your contact? I haven't been able to find someone at Christchurch that can kind of carry the torch forward. Or just...
Tôi khoái cái chỗ này quá à. Chỗ nó đẹp thiệt á. Nó vô mình bước vô là mình thấy đã thôi.
Người ta thấy cái phòng cà phê vậy.
Chưa cầm một xíu chứ. Nhưng mà khi đi vòng này nó rất là đẹp. Sư thấy vô đây cái đường đi vô thấy không? Nó trễ vô đây nó rất là đẹp.
Thiếu nhi bơi đó.
Thiếu nhi rồi cái này nó vô sư thấy giống như một cái thả bơi vậy đó. Thấy đã không? Nó gọn mà nó dễ hiểu mà thấy cái phòng
đây không? Thiếu niên có bệnh.
Đó thiệt á. Mình thấy cái này
có xong, không?
Cái này nó làm đơn sơ nhưng mà đẹp thiệt là đẹp chứ không phải. Rồi tôi thấy cái phòng cà phê này. Cái phòng cà phê nó đã thiệt.
Gọn không?
Gọn.
Làm chiếc cho hết đẹp ha.
Đây là số 1 luôn. Ở ngoài nó trang trí cũng đẹp.
Khô hơn.
Cái bộ này một xíu nha. Đi ra chứ đâu có đó một xíu. Cái này đẹp hết trơn luôn. Nó đồng trắng sao mà đẹp.
Ủa sơ anh muốn tắt này chưa?
Bây giờ đây một xíu. Đây một xíu tắt coi.
Thì mình lấy cái cảnh này đẹp nè, nhà thờ đẹp quá. Cái nhà thờ đẹp thiệt á. Cái này đơn sơ nhưng mà đẹp thiệt cái chứ.
Cái nào một sư với Hùng đi họp với anh. Coi cảnh nói gì nó sau đó mình mời hai đại diện của ban chấp hành.